40. You still have to convince me that feels the same. But many people put up a great fight against the unlikable realities of getting older, of aging. So, we spend time working out. We spend time weighing our food and measuring it just right. We spend time eating kale. I know some of you are lovers of it, and I pray for you. A lot of us try to fight off aging by doing squats or running for miles or taking all sorts of supplements and applying lotions to our skin, all to try to fight this aging process. And the fact is, it is impossible to death-proof our bodies, because that's in fact what we're trying to do. We're trying to death-proof our flesh. It won't work. With more education, with more training, with more behavioral changes, we can reduce the levels of heart disease, diabetes, depression, and neurological disorders. But aging, illness, injury, and death are all natural parts of living in this world that has been broken by sin. Because of sin, we age. Because of sin, we grow old and we die. I want us to go back to the Old Testament before we get into Corinthians. In the story of Job, the devil challenged God about why this man Job had faith in God. Well, God insisted that his servant Job really did trust him. But the devil argued that Job only trusted God when God blessed him. That if God didn't bless him, there would be no trust. So the devil proposed to God to stop blessing Job. Because if you stop blessing him, the devil was just certain that Job would curse God to his face. Well, God allowed the devil to try to prove his case against Job. So Satan unleashed his fury on this man Job. In one day, the devil took everything that God had made Job a steward of, including his children. But to the devil's chagrin and frustration, Job continued to trust God. So the devil challenged God again. And in Job 1, verses 4 and 5, this is what is recorded about this conversation. Skin for skin, Satan answered the Lord. A man will give up everything he owns in exchange for his life. But stretch out your hand and strike his flesh and bones, and he will surely curse you to your face. So this was the devil's argument. Was the devil's perception. That our fears, that human fears about our health are so absolutely controlling, and our instinct to survive is so primal, that the fear of something being wrong with our body will overcome us and cause us to do anything to protect our body, even deny God. But the devil was dead wrong. when it came to Job. He is also wrong about us if we live by faith in God. If you only mouth that you have faith, you will live in fear for your body. But if we truly have faith in God, then the devil's wrong about us as well. Because faith in God conquers fear. Our fears about health, our fears about aging, our fears about all these things that we're looking at in the series. So again, in 2 Corinthians 4, verse 16, through chapter 5, verse 10, we're shown how faith conquers the natural fears that we all have about our health, about our aging, and even about our dying. But I must be convinced that this life, that this time I have here on earth, I must be convinced that this life is only a preparation for eternity. And what I do now has eternal implications. So the life I live now isn't really about now. The life I live now is about then. As long as I'm only living for the now, fear will kick in because we can't grasp and hold to this life that we have now. Because if I don't see this life as a preparation for eternity, I will care way too much about treasures on earth and too little about treasures in heaven. That same perspective is equally crucial for us to be able to conquer our fears about our health, about our aging processes, and about our imminent anytime death. So there are three truths that we must be convinced of before we can conquer these fears. So these are the three truths that we'll look at this week and next week. Today we'll look at the first two. The first truth is this: my body is not permanent, but I am. The second one, temporary physical weaknesses produce eternal spiritual benefits. And next week we'll notice the third one, fears about health and aging are normal, but they are manageable. So let's look at the first point again. To conquer my fears about my health and about my aging process, I must be totally, absolutely convinced that even though this body is not permanent, I am not the composite of this body. I'm much more than just simply this body. Notice what he says in verse 16 here. 2 Corinthians 4, verse 16. This is Paul's, what he's saying to speak to this. Therefore, we do not give up. What he's saying here is we do not live as cowards. Paul was explaining why he remained confident in a very difficult situation. Even though our outer person is being destroyed, our inner person is being renewed day by day. So we need to understand we're not just the composite of this flesh. There's something so much more to us than just what we see on the outside. Paul was probably in his mid-50s, showing some mileage at the time that he writes this letter. His eyes were going bad. His thick black hair was getting thin and gray. He had scars on top of scars from being beaten and from being whipped frequently. He walked a little crooked. His nose was smashed, and he had cauliflower ears from all the stonings he had undergone and all the beating with rods he had endured. His body was not something pleasant to look at after all of that damage. He was probably always pale from spending so much time, so many years in Roman prisons. And in a culture that he lived in a culture that prized physical beauty, Paul was not at all physically attractive. And the saints at Corinth totally bought in to that Greek understanding and Roman mindset. So the saints at Corinth wondered how this man Paul could be so hopeful. Because if they looked anything like him, they would have been so discouraged with their lives. And most of the people of that day viewed suffering as a judgment from the gods. They thought that you were doing something wrong. So the saints at Corinth really wondered if this man Paul was of God. Was he led by God? How could we even say they would think that he is blessed by God? Look at him. So why was his life so difficult, they would ask? Why was he so beat up? Why was he so hated? Why did he spend so much of his time in jail as a prisoner? Why did he suffer so much? Why did he not just back off? Why didn't he even try to hide from the authorities? How come he boldly walked into these cities where he knew these things would happen? How could this man Paul continue to preach the gospel with such courage when his body was shambles as a result of it? Like the Greeks, if we're honest about it, we in the United States in 2020, we idolize health and beauty. We spend so much money on ourselves trying to hide what age is doing to us. So, if a redeemed child of God has a serious health issue, we often wonder, are they really taking care of themselves? As if they wouldn't look that way if they were really taking care of themselves. Because we're so convinced that good health and a long life are always God's best for us. Where did we come up with that? That long life and good health are always God's best for us. As long as he takes care of the flesh, that's God's best for us. Is that really true? Not at all. That's not God's priority. That's our priority, but not God's. We think that we will avoid serious health issues if we make all the right decisions. That's not at all anywhere found in Scripture. That is not a biblical view of life. That's our view of life that we've claimed is biblical. Paul suffered so much. But this is what was amazing about it. Even with all his suffering, he was not discouraged and he was never intimidated. He kept picking himself up and moving forward. Why? Look in verse 16. This is his why. This is why it didn't bother him and why it shouldn't bother us. Even though our outer person is being destroyed, our inner person is being renewed day by day. If we spend all of our time on the outer person, there is not going to be an inner person that's healthy. But if I have my inner person connected to God and I'm feeding it daily and I'm maturing in Christ, I don't care what happens to the external, physical, outer man. Our body is the part of us that people see. But you know what it is that people like? It's what is of God that comes up out from the inner man. So you can look pretty and you can make yourself look 40 when you're 60. But if you're bitter inside and you don't know God inside, you're not going to be a person people want to be around because they'll see the veneer of what you want to be. Paul said his body was being destroyed. We need to see this. His body was being destroyed. And his point was, it's not eternal. So why spend all your life trying to preserve it and bowing to it and idolizing it, and it's not going to last? The body decays. The body shuts down. The body falls apart. In various degrees, all of us in here understand that. But Paul in the face of these things, his decay, his shutting down, his falling apart, he refused to be frightened. Paul refused to be discouraged, no matter what he looked like, no matter what he felt like, because he knew even if his body was decaying, his inner man, his soul, who he really was being renewed day by day because he was walking with God. He was living for God. So what gave him the greatest hope was the building up of his inner man, not the decaying of his outer man. My body's best days may be in the past, but my best days are still in the future. We need to see that distinction. My outer shell has always been intended by God after sin came into the world as a temporary shelter. My inner self, though, is eternal. So which should I spend more time building up? One is temporary, one is eternal. I'm going to leave this body here in some form when I die. But my inner self, what the Bible calls the new creation, that part goes into the presence of God in heaven. This body is not permanent, but I am. We need to see that. I have no control over the constant decay of my body. I can take supplements, I can sit out there over on the deck, I can do my bands, I can do the elliptical, I can do all this great stuff. But my body's still going to decay. I cannot ever defeat what time does to me. But as all this is decaying, my inner man can get stronger and stronger and stronger. This world cannot affect what's going on in my soul. That's what we need to focus on. I can improve my soul each and every day of my life until I breathe my last. The second truth that we need to understand: to conquer my fears about my health and my aging, I must be convinced that my temporary physical problems can produce for me eternal spiritual benefits. So we can either bemoan the decay, or we can grow from the decay. Knowing that my body is temporary and accepting that fact and living that way, knowing that my body is temporary, does not release my fears about my health and about my aging. Just knowing that it's temporary doesn't mean I'm fearless. But I also need to understand why my body suffers. Paul explained how the inner person is renewed daily in verse 17. 4:17. For our momentary light affliction, that would be the stress, confusion, adversity, bad health, those things that take tolls on us. He says that momentary light affliction is producing something. What's it producing? It is producing for us, the us is those who live by faith in God, is producing for us, I love this, an absolutely incomparable eternal weight of glory. So the demise of the flesh can build up the spirit and the soul, waiting for the eternal weight of glory that we have when we see him face to face. So this is exactly why the Apostle Paul, no matter what he went through, was not discouraged, was not intimidated. We don't need to be discouraged or intimidated by the situations of our life. Because when we experience that glory, what it took in this life to prepare us for that glory will make everything down here seem trivial and insignificant. What I'm going to have there and what my soul is building up for there makes everything on the outers and the externals so nothing. We need to see the comparison, and there is no comparison. What that means, every hardship you're facing, all the suffering that you've ever endured and accumulated in your life, everything that we endure in this life has eternal purpose. If we utilize it the way God calls us to. All these challenges that we avoid, all these challenges that we're fearful of, don't be fearful of them. Because our God can use all of them to transform us to look more like Jesus. And we're not going to look like Jesus here. We're going to look like Jesus here. So it may be that this needs to hurt in order for this to grow stronger and flourish. Do not weaken your soul by trying to maintain your flesh, is what Paul is saying here. Jesus, he is recreating the person we will be for eternity. This time in our life is our renovation process. This is the time of renovation. When we get home, that's when we'll enjoy what the renovation brought about. But right now, we're in renovation. Because if you've ever remodeled or renovated property, you've seen it. The walls come down, the floors are ripped up, cabinets are torn apart. Sheetrock is pulled off the studs. It's an ugly process. We don't like to invite people over when our houses are in renovation mode. When you renovate, you know this, there are always surprises when you renovate, right? And those surprises sometimes just push us to despair. We find and discover undetected plumbing leaks. We discover dry rot, electrical problems. The list can go on and on. But through all of that, when the project is completed, there's such joy, isn't there? Such a sense of accomplishment as you look at your completely renovated, beautiful home. To me, this is a perfect illustration of the process that Paul is describing in this text. We're under renovation. And don't be embarrassed for people to see the renovation, because, baby, when you see the end product, you're going to be grateful that other people saw the renovation that takes place. Because it's temporary. And it really has no bearing on who you are. My soul, really, is renovated. My soul is renewed by the adversities in its lessons. They aren't throwaways. They're nothing to be avoided, escaped. They're being placed with what force within us. Who I will be in eternity is being built right now. So are you building for eternity a beautiful structure with God, or are you living an eternity that is not going to be something that you want to be a part of? We are in the middle of the renovation of our souls. Walls need to come down. Mistakes are uncovered in our lives. I do some repairs in the physical, it's in the spiritual as well. You open this up and then you realize all the layers of things were there that need to be undone. Everything's a mess. Yeah, we tried to project. We wore masks long before we wore masks. Trying to let people see my home is finished. We're liars. Our homes aren't finished until we go home. But we've tried to project to people that I don't need renovation. I don't need restoration. I'm beautiful because I use this lotion. There's a nice little plug. I don't do commercials. Here's the thing. More repairs are always needed. As we turn the corner of another season of life, more things are uncovered. More things are repaired. Everything's missed. But if we cooperate, Jesus will finish this renovation. It's not just up to me with my power, my strength, my will, but God renovating me, transforming me. And when we are in eternity and we see who He transformed us to be, we will have such an amazing depth of joy looking at what he did while I was here. And I didn't let it discourage me or intimidate me or cause me to turn my back on God, to try to be like the world. We're so blessed. Many of us have faced hard illnesses. Many of us have dealt with debilitating diseases. You may have experienced seasons of pain and seasons of discomfort, procedures that are far from fun. And the worst part of all of that is not knowing what's going on inside. We wonder. We're with those decent gowns laying on beds that are too short for most people. We wonder if our problem is serious. Sometimes we wonder as we're lying there if we're dying. This text helps me to realize that whatever happens to my physical body, it is part of my spiritual training. Lying on a gurney with an indecent robe is part of your spiritual training. Don't let fear occupy your mind. Let faith occupy your heart. I need to experience pain. I need to experience uncertainty so that I can become like God in the flesh. So I can become the image bearer God created me to be. What a privilege. It's a humbling process. Momentary light affliction produces for me an eternal weight of glory. We must have faith in God's wise plan for our lives right now and also for our lives in the future. Because when we have faith in God's wise plan, it conquers our fears about health, it conquers our fears about aging, and it conquers our fears about death. Every redeemed child of God will suffer. That's a fact. But for many, suffering does not make them better. Unfortunately, for many, suffering just makes them bitter. And that's why Paul adds in verse 18, so we do not, hear this, we do not focus on what is seen, but on what is unseen. For what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal. If Paul had focused only on temporary things, he would have been the most discouraged man in history. He looked at all the scars and felt the aches and pains and saw through the haziness of his eyes and went up to touch the hair that was no longer there. When he looked at the condition of his body, he would have been discouraged. His situation would have absolutely terrified him. Here's the fact. Serving Jesus had worn him down. The stress of being what God wanted him to be was killing him. It was killing his flesh. So many people wanted him dead. We read his letters, we love his letters, talk about his letters, but we don't identify with the man who wrote the letters because most of the world wanted him gone. But we're living for the flesh. We want everyone to love us. Which is it? Which is the path of eternity with God? You might say, you have both. You can't. You cannot. Jesus was God in the flesh. After he was died and after all these years of teaching and healing, 120 people were left behind thinking of 120. Paul could have viewed his service to God as a hazard to his health. Oh, I don't know if we need to do that anymore, becoming kind of old, being certain. But Paul did not focus on the flesh. He focused on what was not seen. God's promises and eternity kept Paul going strong, regardless of the situation. So looking at your body's physical problems through the lens of only the flesh, life will terrify you. If you look at your body's problems through the lens of eternity, you will find peace, regardless of the situation. Only faith conquers fears, not a facelift. God has told us what the future holds. He's told us clearly. But here's the question. Do I really believe him? Or do I see this life as all there is and desperately grab its pleasures and its comforts and its conveniences? Am I terrified by anything that seems to threaten the good things of this life that I am wanting? To follow Jesus, truly follow Jesus, I must see this life as a very, very brief time to prepare my soul for an eternity of glory. This life is where the glory is intended to be. What matters most to me now, what matters most to us now, should be what matters the most when we're in heaven. So we don't need to have just the perspective here to there. We need to have perspective there to here. What's going to be most important to me when I'm in heaven ought to be what's most important to me now, if I'm living for heaven. If you fear about your health, or if you fear seeing life through the wrong lens, we're here for you. We're here to walk beside you. We're here to help you again. So this morning, if there's anything we can help you with spiritually, so that fear does not replace your faith, please come as we stand together as we sing.